The vote to exile Earth was approved. Then humanity made their rules clear. The chamber smelled like burnt ozone and old decisions. I counted the ceiling tiles. 612 species packed into the Galactic Conclave's Grand Hall, and not a single one of them was looking at the ceiling. They were all watching the speaker's platform, where Ambassador Threll of the Velhari Dominion stood in robes the deep color of a bruise and read the resolution that was going to change everything. I was on tile 212 when he got to the part about Earth. I started over. My name is Commander Yara Ose Mensa. I command the flagship Adamantine under the UN Coalition Fleet. I had flown 14 hours to sit in this chair. The observer seat, the one bolted to the left wall with a smaller nameplate than everyone else's, the one they'd given Earth 22 years ago as a courtesy. The kind of courtesy that means, you may watch but not speak, you may listen but not matter. I had worn my full dress uniform. I had shined my boots. I had done all of it, because my fleet admiral had said representation matters even at a funeral, and this was, in every practical sense, a funeral. The resolution ran to 4,000 pages of supporting documentation. I had read every one of them on the transit jump. I had annotated the sections that were factually wrong. There were 63. I did not submit the corrections. Threll's voice carried well. It had the kind of deep resonance that makes bad news sound inevitable. He spoke in conclave standard, which every species in the room had translation rigs for, and the sound of 612 simultaneous translation feeds filled the hall with a low, continuous hum that my rig filtered out automatically. I'd learned to hear through it years ago. The hum was there the day they told us about the Accra, too. In a different chamber, a different species delivering different news with the same tone of performed regret. I counted tiles. The resolution, Threll said, and the hall dropped to silence so complete I could hear the environmental system circulating air 3 levels above us. Passes with 489 votes in favor. 489. Out of 612. Humanity's observer status is hereby revoked. Earth and its colonial holdings are formally excised from Galactic Conclave membership, trade protections, and navigational treaty obligations, effective in 30 standard cycles. The room erupted. Not in the human way, not in shouts and the scraping of chairs. 612 species express strong feeling in 612 ways, and the sound that filled the chamber was somewhere between a symphony and a natural disaster. Clicking, resonant low tones, the sharp percussive bursts of species that communicate through pressure waves. The air turned thick with it. I counted tile 247. All present. All accounted for. I stood, straightened my jacket. The noise in the room dropped in the way that noise drops when something with threat assessment instincts detects movement it wasn't expecting. Not silence. A hesitation. Several of the closer delegations shifted in their seats in ways that were specific to their species' alarm response. I had studied those responses, not to exploit them, just to understand what I was working with. No one had invited me to the speaker's platform. The observer seat came with no speaking rights, no floor time, no formal access to the lectern. 22 years of Earth representatives had understood this, and stayed in their seats when addressed, answered questions when asked, and otherwise occupied their ornamental function with quiet dignity. I walked to the lectern anyway. There was a moment where the chamber security could have stopped me. 4 conclave guards at the main floor level, 2 more at the platform stairs. I watched each of them in my peripheral vision. None of them moved, not because they were commanded to stand down, but because nothing in their training had prepared them for the specific situation of an observer walking to the platform, and in the absence of a protocol, they defaulted to watching. I set my data tablet on the lectern with a sound quieter than I intended, cleared my throat once. Not from nerves, from the recycled air in the hall, which was always too dry at these altitudes. 612 species looked at me. I looked at them. I would like, I said, and my voice carried the way it always carries, flat and even, and pitched to reach the back of a room without effort, to formally acknowledge receipt of the resolution. Threll stood to my left on the platform, still at his own podium. His coloring, the bioluminescent strips along the ridge of his head that his species used to signal emotional state, had shifted to something I couldn't immediately name. His translator rig was active. He understood every word. Additionally, I said, I'd like to note that the 30-cycle grace period presents a scheduling conflict. The room processed this. We won't be needing it. I picked up my tablet, walked back to my seat, sat down. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. I know because I counted them. Then the noise resumed, louder than before, and Threll tried to re-establish floor order, and the procedural machinery of the conclave ground back into motion around me, like I was a stone in a river. I had 3 things in my jacket pocket: a pen, a folded photograph, a data chip the size of my thumbnail, matte gray, the kind of casing that looks like it holds routine maintenance schedules, 11 pages on it. I had read them enough times to recite them without looking. I had helped write them over 4 years of quiet work, late nights, careful conversations in channels that were never logged in conclave databases, and one very long period of sitting very still and waiting for the inevitable to become official. The inevitable was now official. The 30 cycles they had given us were 30 cycles they had given themselves to feel like they'd been generous. We didn't need 30 cycles. We didn't need 30 hours. The work was done. It had been done for months. All that remained was delivery. I looked at the ceiling one more time. 247 tiles. Every one exactly where I'd left it. I am not a woman who prays. But I made one quiet and private acknowledgement in that moment to the 4,000 people who had been aboard the Accra when the Velhari called it an incidental contact and moved on with their day. I told them, without words, in the way you tell things to people who can no longer answer, that the next 30 cycles were going to be interesting. Then I got up, walked out of the chamber, and called Fleet Admiral Nakamura. She picked up before the first tone finished. "How'd they take it?" she asked. 489 in favor, I said. A pause. "That's more than projected." "Yes. Are you all right?" I thought about it honestly. The way you think about a question, when someone who knows you well enough to ask it, deserves a real answer. "Tell me the fleets are in position," I said. "All 7, she said. 0400, confirmed." "Then I'm fine," I said. "I'm coming home." The docking bay of the transit hub smelled like fuel and cleaning solution, and the particular exhaustion of spaces that are always busy and never resting. I walked through it without stopping, without speaking, without giving the cluster of journalists near the exit gate anything worth recording. One of them called my name. I kept walking. Another one called my rank. I kept walking. I had a ship to get back to. The work wasn't done yet. It was just beginning. The first memo arrived 6 hours after the vote. I read it in the shuttle pod on the way back to the Adamantine, on a data screen barely larger than my palm, in the low amber light that the pod's navigation system used during long transit runs. The memo was from the Conclave's Office of Treaty Implementation, and it ran to 31 pages, which was 30 pages longer than it needed to be, because bureaucracies measure their importance by the weight of their paperwork. The core of it was simple. As of the vote's effective date, human vessels traversing contested corridors between conclave-governed systems would do so outside the protection of any navigational treaty. The conclave bore no liability for, and here was the phrase, sitting in the middle of page 4 like it had every right to be there, incidental contact with sovereign territorial enforcement. Incidental contact. I read the phrase 3 times. Then I added it to a file I'd been building for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. The file had no official designation. I had never submitted it through formal channels. It lived on a personal encrypted drive, and its contents were exactly what they sound like. A running record of every time someone in this galaxy had used clean language to describe something that wasn't clean. The Accra had been incidental contact too. 4,000 colonists, most of them families, relocating to a new settlement on the edge of the Dembe outer belt, traveling in a registered civilian vessel on a charted corridor, with full conclave navigational clearance. The Velhari border enforcement ship that intercepted them claimed the corridor had been reclassified. The reclassification had been filed 17 hours before the Accra entered it. The Accra had no way of knowing. No alert had been sent. What happened next was not, according to the conclave's official record, an act of aggression. It was not a hostile engagement. It was not anything that required a formal response or a sanction, or even a genuine apology. It was incidental. I closed the memo file, opened a different one. This one had a name. The file was called Noted, and it was not a record of grievances. It was a record of plans, and the plans were good ones, and they had been running for 4 years, and as of this morning, they were in their final stage. The Adamantine received me the way it always does. The docking clamps engaged with a harmonic that my chief engineer, a compact and exacting man named Gordon Lyle, had spent 2 years trying to eliminate from the docking mechanism and had ultimately classified as a structural artifact and given up on. It was not a structural artifact. I had long since decided it was the ship being glad, and I kept this conclusion to myself because I command a warship, not a creative writing workshop. Fleet Admiral Nakamura was on the bridge. She had been waiting. The particular quality of her stillness told me she had been waiting for several hours, which meant she had rearranged multiple briefings to be here when I arrived, which she would not mention, and I would not thank her for, because that was how we worked. Nakamura had a face that gave nothing away to anyone who didn't know her. To me, after 9 years of serving under her command, her face gave away everything. What it was giving away right now was the particular expression she reserved for moments when a plan she had spent years building was entering its active phase, completely still, jaw slightly set, eyes already somewhere ahead of the current moment. "How'd they take it?" she asked. "They used the word incidental," I said. She closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them, moved on. That was the most she had ever allowed herself on the subject of the Accra, in my presence, and it was enough. 7 fleets, she said, repositioned as of 0400. Stations Kiru, Dembe, and New Carthage are dark as of this morning. I looked at her. All 3? Population relocations complete, across all designated sites, she said. Down to the last registered vessel in the outer belt. We pulled everyone. Everyone. I let that sit for a moment. The conclave had just voted to cut Earth off, to revoke our trade protections, our navigational rights, our diplomatic standing. They had done this under the assumption that Earth, like every other species that had ever been on the receiving end of this particular mechanism, would fight to stay inside, would negotiate, would concede ground, make promises, accept conditions, and shrink. That assumption had been wrong for 4 years. We had not been negotiating. We had been moving. Quietly, systematically, through logistics operations that looked like standard colonial supply runs and medical transport convoys and agricultural equipment shipments. We had been relocating every civilian from every station and settlement and outpost that the conclave believed they were cutting off. It had taken 4 years because we had done it without drawing attention, without large visible fleet movements, without anything that would flag an alert in the conclave's monitoring systems. 83,000 people. Families, workers, engineers, teachers, farmers, children who had grown up on orbital stations and never set foot on a planetary surface. All of them moved, quietly, in stages, to positions the conclave did not know about, through corridors the conclave had not thought to watch, under registration codes that looked like routine commerce. Kiru Station, which the conclave envoy ship would arrive at in 11 days to begin overseeing the transition, currently had 17 people in it. All 17 were volunteers. All 17 were there for a specific purpose. The envoy, I said. The conciliator, Nakamura said. Velhari Registry. Threll's second attached, an envoy named Salvreth, scheduled to arrive at Kiru in 11 days for transition supervision. I nodded. The rules brief, I said. Ready? Nakamura reached into the inner pocket of her uniform jacket and set a data chip on the console between us. Same matte gray casing as the one I'd been carrying. Same dimensions. 2 of them now, sitting on the console of my flagship, each one containing 11 pages that had taken 4 years to write and would take approximately 40 minutes to read. Gordon wants to know, she said, if you want a full fleet formation when the conciliator enters Kiru's approach corridor. I thought about it. No, I said. Just the adamantine. Just us. Just us, I said. One ship is a statement. A fleet formation is a threat. We're not making a threat. She understood. She always understood. It was one of the reasons we had worked together for 9 years without a single significant disagreement, which in military service is either a sign of compatible temperament or dangerous group thinking, and I had concluded years ago that in our case, it was the former. What are we making? She asked anyway, because she liked to hear things said aloud. It was a habit she'd had since the academy, where she'd been known for making her cadets verbalize their tactical reasoning out loud before acting on it. We're making a delivery, I said. The 11 days between the vote and the conciliator's arrival at Kiru Station were the strangest days I had experienced in my career, and my career had included 3 border skirmishes, 1 full engagement, and the morning I had stood in a conclave corridor and been told that the Accra was gone. The strangeness was not dramatic. It was the strangeness of waiting when you already know what is going to happen, and the universe hasn't caught up yet. The Conclave's Office of Treaty Implementation sent 14 more memos. I read each one. None of them changed anything. They were elaborate documents describing a situation that did not exist in the form they believed it did, like detailed instructions for rearranging furniture in a room that had already been emptied. My executive officer, Lieutenant Kwame Abara, was 31 years old, methodical, and possessed of the particular quality that makes a good executive officer. He anticipated what I needed before I asked for it, and then waited for me to ask before providing it, which meant I always felt efficient, and he always stayed invisible, which suited both of us. On day 4, he set a tablet on my desk with the Conclave's proposed blockade resolution on it. I read it. Set it down. "They're proposing to seal the Kiru approach corridor," Abara said. "I see that. They'll need vessels from at least 3 member species to make it viable. Yes. The Orvan Cooperative uses that corridor for 40% of their pharmaceutical supply chain." I looked at him. He looked back at me. "Noted," I said. He took the tablet back. On day 7, the blockade proposal quietly failed to advance past committee. The official reason cited was logistical complexity, requiring further assessment. The unofficial reason, which Abara sourced from a contact in the Conclave Communications Office, was that 2 of the 3 species asked to provide enforcement vessels had run navigation calculations and discovered that sealing the corridor would also seal off their own supply routes, and the Conclave's navigational treaty protections, the ones they had revoked from Earth, did not cover enforcement actions in what was now technically undesignated space. They had created a legal gray zone that applied to everyone equally. This had not been their intention. I found this deeply restful. On day 9, I began reviewing the full version of the rules brief for the last time before delivery. Not because I had forgotten any of it, because there is a quality that comes from reading something you've helped build, something you've tested and refined, and argued over in late-night sessions with people you trust, that is different from reading something someone else wrote. It felt like checking the weight of a tool before using it, confirming that it was still what you remembered, still balanced, still right. 11 pages. No demands, no requests, no negotiating positions, no threats. Just a description of what was. I read it 3 times on day 9, twice on day 10. Once on day 11, in the early morning, before the conciliator's approach signal appeared on the Adamantine's long-range array. Then I put on my uniform, drank my coffee, and went to meet Salvreth at Kiru Station. The docking clamps on Kiru's Bay 4 engaged with a different sound than the Adamantine's. Older mechanism, less maintained. The station had been operational for 18 years and showed it in the particular way functional things show age. Not broken, not failing, just settled into itself in a way that suggested many years of ordinary use. 17 people in a station, built for 900. The corridors echoed. I walked from the docking bay to conference room 3, and Abara walked beside me with his tablet under his arm, and the 2 volunteers who had stayed behind walked ahead of us because they knew the station better than we did. Dr. Amara Diallo was 71 years old and had the posture of someone who had stopped tolerating nonsense approximately 3 decades ago and had never looked back. She had been the chief medical officer of Kiru Station for 11 of its 18 years. She had delivered 42 babies in this station's medical bay. She had buried 2 people here. She had been the last to vote on whether to stay when we'd asked for volunteers, and when she'd raised her hand, she'd done it with the calm of someone who had already thought it through and arrived at a conclusion she was comfortable with. Chief Petty Officer Dominic Torres was 44, built like a structural component, and had served on the sister ship to the Accra. He did not talk about that. He didn't need to. It was in the way he stood in rooms, the way he watched people who worked for the Velhari government, with a quality of attention that was professional and precise and had nothing welcoming in it at all. The conciliator docked 12 minutes after we arrived. Salvreth came through the corridor with 3 aides and the deliberate pace of a diplomat who has learned that arriving without urgency signals power. He was the Velhari's best. I had read his file in detail over the past 3 years, not casually, not as background research, but with the specific focus of someone studying a problem they intend to solve. 14 treaties, 3 resolved conflicts. A reputation for identifying exactly what the other party needed and making access to it conditional on cooperation. He was very good at his work. He walked into conference room 3. I was already seated. Ibarra stood at the door. Dr. Diallo and Chief Torres were at the far end of the table. Salvreth looked at the room, looked at the number of people in it, processed the absence of a formal diplomatic setup. No display screens, no translation stations beyond standard rigs, no ceremonial table arrangement. He sat. His crest strips shifted to the color and frequency that Velhari behavioral studies identified as open engagement, cooperative posture. He had tuned his visible signals for warmth, for the opening of a negotiation. I set the data chip on the table. "This is the document," I said. He looked at it. His translator rig processed. "I was told there would be a formal presentation of Earth's position regarding the transition timeline. That is the formal presentation." He looked at the chip. I folded my hands on the table and waited. His lead aide ran a security scan. Standard Velhari protocol. Checking for encoded signals, embedded programs, anything that could be used to compromise their systems through the data transfer. It came back clean. Everything in the chip was exactly what it appeared to be. Text. 11 pages of plain text with no metadata beyond the document date. He loaded it. Read the header. His crest strips shifted color. It was subtle. A flicker. Gone in less than a second. But I was watching for it. And I saw it. And the color it shifted to was one I had looked up specifically before this meeting. The Velhari called it thresin. Their behavioral researchers described it as the sensation of reaching for something familiar and finding it has changed shape. "This document," he said carefully, "does not contain a list of demands." "No," I agreed. "It does not contain a negotiating position." "No." His aide was reading faster now, scrolling through pages at a speed that suggested she was looking for the part where the demands appeared. She said something to Salvreth in their own language, low and quick, and my rig translated it as approximately, "There are no requests anywhere in this document." Salvreth looked up at me. "What is this?" he asked. "A description," I said. "Of what is?" The 11 pages were constructed with the same care you bring to anything that has to function perfectly the first time it is used, because there will not be a second chance, and you have known that from the beginning. No rhetorical flourishes, no emotional weight, no language designed to intimidate or to wound, just precise, clear, factual description of the current state of reality, written in the style of a technical document because that is what it was. Page 1. The current location of human fleet assets, as of 72 hours prior. Not the registered positions, the actual positions. 7 fleets, repositioned over 4 years of gradual and unremarkable movement, now occupying corridors and zones that had nothing to do with the trade routes the Conclave had just revoked protection on, because those trade routes were no longer the routes we were using. Page 2. A complete list of every station, outpost, and colonial holding the Conclave believed they were severing Earth from, cross-referenced with their actual current population numbers. Kiru Station, 17, then 2, because Dr. Diallo and Chief Torres would be departing in approximately 4 hours. New Carthage, 0. Dembe Outer Belt installations, 0. 41 total sites listed. Combined actual population across all of them, 31. All volunteers, all departing within the next standard cycle. They had voted to cut us off from our territory. We had already left it. Page 3. Navigational Corridor Documentation. The Conclave had revoked Earth's navigational protections. What they had not done, because it had not occurred to anyone that it needed doing, because no species had ever made it relevant before, was revoke Earth's physical access to the corridors themselves. The corridors were now unprotected space. Not human space. Not Conclave space. Undesignated. Open. Available to anyone willing to travel through them without treaty backing. We were willing. We had been traveling through difficult spaces without backing for a long time. It was not new to us. It was, in a manner that I will not pretend was not somewhat satisfying, something we were considerably better at than most of the species who had just voted to leave us to it. Pages 4 through 8 were technical. They described, in the flat and informational language of an engineering manual, what human warship systems were capable of, what human crew performance metrics looked like under extended operational stress, what human damage control doctrine was, and how it differed from every other species the Conclave had on record. Not boasting, not posturing. just description. This is what these machines do. This is what the people inside them do when things go wrong. This is what we are. Several of the Conclave's member species had, over the past century, made the mistake of evaluating humanity based on our apparent physical limitations and concluding that we were fragile, short-lived, and therefore manageable. The technical pages did not argue with this conclusion. They simply documented the gap between what we appeared to be and what we had repeatedly demonstrated ourselves to be, in every conflict, engagement, and crisis that had made it into the Conclave's own historical record. We were not arguing. We were providing reference material. Page 9 was the one I had read 47 times. It listed 12 bilateral agreements, built over 4 years, with 12 different species outside the Conclave's central trade architecture. Not secret agreements, not hidden ones, just quiet ones, built-in channels that were never required to be logged in Conclave databases, with parties who had reasons of their own to want conversations that weren't being observed. None of the 12 were Conclave founding members. Several were species the Conclave regarded as peripheral, minor, not particularly consequential in the larger political structure of the galaxy. The Conclave had made a consistent and understandable error about what mattered. They measured significance in fleet size, in territorial holdings, in centuries of established presence. They were very good at measuring these things. They had missed the thing that didn't appear in any of those measurements: position. Several of those 12 species occupied corridors, produced resources, or controlled access to systems that were considerably more important than their status suggested. We had noticed this. We had been very pleasant about it. Page 10 was short, a single paragraph, and then one sentence by itself below it. The paragraph stated that Earth and its affiliated holdings were not requesting re-entry to the Galactic Conclave, were not requesting restoration of trade protections, navigational agreements, or diplomatic recognitions, did not require any of these things in their current configuration, as the preceding 9 pages made clear. The sentence below it, alone on the page, read, "We are simply making our position clear." Page 11 was the terms under which Earth would consider any future dialogue with Conclave member species. Not demands, not prices to be paid, just the specific conditions under which a conversation could occur. Written the way you write a meeting request. Polite, precise, and not open to modification because the preceding 10 pages had already established that modification was not something we were seeking. These were not opening terms. They were the only terms. Salvreth read all of it. His 3 aides read it with him. The aide who had been scrolling rapidly slowed down around page 6 and did not speed up again. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the air circulation system in the corridor outside. Dr. Diallo was very still at her end of the table. Chief Torres was watching Salvreth with the specific quality of attention I had come to know as his baseline in rooms with Velhari officials. When Salvreth finished, he looked up. His crest strips were the color with no clean translation. Thressen, the thing that changes shape when you reach for it. You had 4 years, he said. We're patient, I said, when we have a reason to be. He looked at the chip, at the table, at me. He was the best diplomat the Velhari had produced in a generation, and what was on his face right now was not what a diplomat looked like. It was what a man looked like when the ground under him has turned out to be something other than ground. 14 treaties, 3 resolved conflicts, a career built on knowing what the other party needed and making it conditional. He had come here to find out what we needed. We didn't need anything. That was, in a way, the whole document. Is there anything else? He asked. Page 11, I said. I stood. Ibarra opened the conference room door. Dr. Diallo and Chief Torres rose. We left Salvreth and his aides in the room with the chip on the table between them, and we walked back down the echoing corridor to the docking bay, and we went home. The Conclave's enforcement mechanism was, in theory, elegant. Revoke protection. Issue territorial declarations. Coordinate member state economic withdrawal, so that the target entity felt pressure arriving from every direction at once, with no single point to push back against. No one responsible for any individual consequence. It was a system designed by experienced politicians who had applied it successfully to 37 species over 3 centuries, and it worked every single time. It worked because every species it had ever been applied to wanted something the Conclave controlled. I was rereading page 9 when Ibarra knocked on my office door at 0700 on day 6. I had been reading it since 0530. 47 times now, across the 11 days since the vote. I found it restful in the way that useful things are restful, the satisfaction of a plan that still made sense each time you looked at it, that hadn't developed hidden flaws during the night. Page 9 listed 12 bilateral agreements, 12 species, 12 sets of frameworks that had been quietly constructed over 4 years, and were now quietly functioning, moving goods and resources and technical assistance through channels the conclave had no awareness of, no authority over, and no mechanism to interfere with. "Come in," I said. Ibarra entered with a tablet, and the expression he used when the news was interesting. Not good, not bad, interesting, which in our line of work was usually the most useful category. "The blockade proposal," he said. "Yes. It failed committee on day 6. I set down the page. Official reason? Logistical complexity requiring further assessment. He paused. Actual reason. The Orvan Cooperative and 2 of the Tharketh outer systems ran navigation numbers and found that sealing the designated corridors would also interrupt their own supply chains. And the enforcement action would take place in technically undesignated space, which the Conclave's own navigational treaty protections don't cover. I looked at him. "They made a hole," he said. "And then they fell through it." "They made a hole," I agreed. "And they used it to cut us off." "Yes. And now the hole is just a hole." "Yes, Commander." "Noted," I said. He went back to his station. The economic penalty drafts hit committee on day 11. They stalled on day 12 when the Orvan Cooperative, 5 systems, significant pharmaceutical output, a representative council that had been having quiet conversations with a party they were being deliberately vague about for approximately 3 years, submitted a formal request for clarification. They wanted to know whether the economic penalties would extend to commercial relationships with entities operating outside conclave trade architecture, and if so, could the committee provide a precise legal definition of what that meant, because they had entered into several arrangements that might fall under that definition, and they wanted to understand their exposure before proceeding. The committee asked for clarification on their clarification request. The Orvans said they were happy to wait. Gordon Lyle came to my office on day 14 with a fuel efficiency report that did not require my personal review, which meant he wanted to talk about something that was not fuel efficiency. Gordon ran his ship-related concerns through technical pretexts, the way some people run emotional conversations through discussions of the weather. I had worked with him long enough to know the difference. I waved him to the chair across from my desk. He sat, set the fuel report between us, did not reference it. "The Keth reached out," he said. The Keth Mercantile Bloc was the second largest trading entity in the quadrant. They had been conclave founding members for over a century. They had voted in favor of the Exile with what the formal record described as unambiguous bloc consensus, and they had issued a press statement afterward using the phrase, "long overdue," and their lead representative had shaken Threll's hand at the reception after the vote, in a way that was photographed by 17 different galactic news services. "When?" I said. 0300, Gordon said. "Personal encryption. Your name on it, not your rank." "Where is it?" He pulled a second tablet from under the fuel report and set it on my desk. I read it. The Keth wrote in an elaborate formal register that their translation from their native script compressed into something more direct than they intended. The first paragraph was pleasantries. The second was a careful statement of their view, that the vote had been conducted with incomplete modeling of prospective outcomes, which was the Keth diplomatic phrase for a mistake. The third was an inquiry about whether Earth's bilateral conversation framework was still open to new participants. The fourth paragraph was one sentence. "We recognize this conversation is occurring on your terms. We are writing anyway." I set the tablet down, picked up my coffee. It was cold. I drank it anyway. "Gordon," I said. "Commander, tell Ibarra to draft a reply. Polite, professional, acknowledge receipt. Tell them the framework has availability, and the terms are on page 11. He nodded, stood, picked up the fuel report, which we both knew he was going to file without either of us reading it. "Gordon," I said again. He stopped. "How's the ship?" I asked. Not the fuel systems, not the maintenance schedules, the ship. He thought about it for a moment in the way he always thought about things, fully, without rushing. "She's good," he said. "She's ready." I nodded. He left. I opened page 9. 48. The Keth communique was not a surprise. The timing was earlier than my most optimistic projection, but the content was exactly what 4 years of careful preparation had been designed to produce. The Conclave's exile mechanism required a target that needed what the Conclave had to offer. Cut off from trade protections, the target species would lose access to established commercial networks. Cut off from navigational rights, they would lose safe passage through major corridors. Cut off from diplomatic standing, they would lose the ability to make agreements with protected parties. All of this was true, and it would have been devastating if we had been where they thought we were. We were not where they thought we were. The 12 species on page 9 occupied specific positions in specific corridors that we had identified, over 4 years of careful study, as the actual load-bearing joints of galactic commerce. Not the famous routes, not the high-traffic lanes that everyone knew and monitored, the quiet ones, the secondary corridors that weren't glamorous enough to be strategically obvious but were, in practice, the passages that the most critical things moved through. Medicines, rare manufacturing components, agricultural seed stocks, the unglamorous infrastructure of a functioning civilization. We had built relationships there, quietly, pleasantly, with no pressure and very specific terms. The Keth had voted to exile us. They had done it confidently, with consensus, because the math they had run showed a comfortable margin of advantage. Cut off Earth, acquire its territory, absorb its trade routes at pennies on the value, redistribute the benefit among members who had supported the resolution. The math had been correct. For the situation as they understood it. The situation as they understood it was not the situation. Day 17 brought 2 more messages, not from Conclave members, from species that had abstained in the vote, not opposed, not in favor, officially neutral. One of them was a quiet, long-lived civilization that had been navigating galactic politics for 400 years, through the consistent strategy of never fully committing to anything and always being available for a conversation. They sent a single-sentence message: "We would like to understand page 11 better." I sent them a meeting request. The other was more complicated, a civilization called the Verith, who occupied 3 systems at the edge of the quadrant's main trade cluster, who had been Conclave members for 60 years and had voted to abstain, not out of principle, but out of the particular political caution of a species that had been on the wrong side of a Conclave decision once before and had never fully recovered from it. Their message was longer, written in their native register, and took my translation rig several minutes to process fully. The core of it was this: they had been watching the past 17 days. They had watched the blockade proposal fail. They had watched the economic penalty drafts stall. They had read the 11 pages, which Salvreth's mission report had apparently included in full, because Conclave diplomatic protocol required complete documentation of all materials received during official contact, and the mission report had been distributed to all member species. They were writing to say that they had found the document interesting. I found this delightful. Not visibly. I did not express it to anyone, but in the privacy of my own office, with my cold coffee and my 48th reading of page 9, I allowed myself the specific satisfaction of a plan working the way a plan is supposed to work, when it has been built carefully by people who cared about getting it right. Ibarra knocked again at midday. "The Conclave sent a formal notice of intent," he said. "They're restating the terms of the exile. Effective date of the original resolution. Standard reinforcement communication." "File it," I said. "Yes, Commander." He didn't move. "There's something else." "What?" Salvreth requested a communication channel. I looked up. "Not official," Ibarra said. "Personal. To you specifically." He cited mutual professional respect as the basis for the request. I thought about Salvreth sitting in that conference room on Kiru Station, reading 11 pages that contained no demands, his crest shifting to a color that meant the ground had changed shape. "Not yet," I said. Ibarra nodded. "When?" he asked, which was not a question he usually asked, because he usually knew the answer. "Page 11 will tell him when," I said. I went back to page 9. The ceremony was on a 14-hour broadcast delay. I watched it alone in my quarters with food that Ibarra had left outside my door, because he is the kind of officer who understands that there are moments when a person needs to be alone with something difficult, and also needs to not skip a meal, and he manages both requirements simultaneously, without requiring acknowledgement. The food was rice and stew. He had gotten the spicing right. I did not know how he knew. I had not told him. I ate it while a junior correspondent from Galnet covered the ceremony live from the conclave chamber, his voice carrying the slightly hollow quality of someone who expected to be somewhere more important and was professionally concealing his disappointment. The gallery was a quarter full. They read the resolution again, the full formal version, with the effective date attached, making it permanent record in the conclave's archives. A technician in a gray service uniform removed one data node from the wall panel that held 2,000, which updated the membership display to reflect Earth's removal. Then the technician removed the observer plaque from its position on the gallery wall. Brushed titanium, Earth's name rendered in 6 conclave scripts. We had been given it 22 years ago when we achieved observer status, at a ceremony where there had been considerably more people in the room, and where Threll's predecessor had expressed what he called warm admiration for humanity's progress toward galactic integration, in a tone that meant, "You are doing remarkably well for a species we expect very little of." I had attended that ceremony. I remembered the light in the room. I remembered how the plaque caught it. I turned off the feed. Opened page 9. 49. Formalization papers had arrived for agreements 6 through 9 in the past 72 hours. The Orvan Cooperative, formally. 2 systems whose full designations my translation notes rendered as something like the Confederation of the Pale Drift and the 7 Voice Accord, names that did not appear in the Conclave's major player databases, but that controlled, between them, access to 3 pharmaceutical precursor compounds that 12 different Conclave member species required for their basic medical infrastructure. We had not pointed this out to anyone. It was in the document. Anyone who read pages 3 through 5, and then looked at page 9, could make the connection themselves. We had simply provided the facts. What people built from them was their own work. The 4th formalization that arrived overnight was the complicated one. A civilization that had been a Conclave founding member for 300 years, whose name I will not include in this record, because they had requested it be kept from official documentation for now. Their request had come with encryption, so careful, it had taken my signals team 4 hours to fully unpack it, which was not a criticism of my signals team, who are excellent, but a reflection of how seriously this particular species took the management of their political relationships. Their message said 3 things. They did not want it known they were talking to us yet. They were talking to us. They had found page 11 reasonable. Yet, in their message, was doing an enormous amount of work. I had been awake since 0300, which was not unusual. I sleep in installments, always have, something my doctors have noted with concern over the years, and that I have continued to regard as a workable personal characteristic, rather than a problem to be solved. At 0500 I dressed, drank the coffee Gordon left in the small machine outside my office door every morning without being asked, and went to the bridge. The Adamantine's bridge at 0500 had a specific quality of light and sound that I had never tried to explain to anyone who had not worked a warship. The essential systems run on different rhythms at different hours, and the people who understand the ship best know her rhythms without thinking about them, the way you know the sounds of a house you've lived in for years. The navigation console had a low harmonic. The communications array made a sound at the edge of hearing that meant it was processing traffic, but not yet routing anything significant. The environmental system ran a 30-second cycle that you could learn to measure by, if you worked here long enough. I had worked here long enough. I sat in the command chair and did nothing official for 20 minutes. Just sat, listened to the ship. Let the quiet of 0500 do what quiet at that hour does, which is tell you clearly, and without drama, what you actually think, stripped of everything that accumulates during the hours when you are performing competence for other people. What I thought was this: it was working. The 4 years of careful, unglamorous, sometimes tedious work of building something that did not require the Conclave's permission or protection was working. Not because we had been clever in any dramatic sense, but because we had been accurate. We had correctly identified what mattered and then consistently acted on that identification for 4 years without losing patience or direction. 4,000 people on the Acra would not be alive to see it. I had not forgotten this. I had not processed it in any of the ways that the UN Coalition's mandatory counseling program recommended, because I had not had the time, and I was aware that I would need to address this at some point, and that point was not yet. There was still work. At 0630, a communications alert lit the array. Not from a Conclave member, from a personal vessel, Velhari Registry, transmitting from a position approximately 40 minutes from the Adamantine's current location. requesting docking permission. No advance coordination. No official designation of any kind. The biometric data attached to the approach scan matched Ambassador Threll. Ibarra was on the bridge by 0700, his arrival so prompt that he had clearly been watching the alert from his own quarters. He stood at the communications station and looked at me without saying the obvious thing, which was one of his best qualities. "Let him dock," I said. "Conference room 3. He nodded. "The good one?" "The good one," I said. Threll came through the docking corridor alone. No aides, no security, no diplomatic protocol. He was wearing a plain travel coat over his formal uniform, the kind of coat that indicated a personal journey rather than an official one, and he carried nothing except a rectangular object wrapped in a cloth that I recognized before he set it down, because I had just watched a technician remove it from a wall on a broadcast feed, and the dimensions were exactly what I remembered from the last time I had seen it in person, 22 years ago. He set it on the conference table. The cloth fell away. Brushed titanium, Earth's name in 6 scripts. He stood on his side of the table. I stood on mine. He did not sit and did not speak, and neither did I, for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. His crest strips were a color I had never seen on him in any of the formal contexts I had encountered him, which were many, which were all the wrong contexts for seeing what a person actually looks like. He looked like a man who had done something he knew was wrong when he did it, not in ignorance, but in the calculated conviction that it was strategically correct, and that strategic correctness was sufficient justification. He looked like a man who had since discovered that there are things strategic correctness does not actually cover. The plaque was heavy. I knew this from 22 years ago. 2 kilograms approximately of titanium alloy with the particular quality of density that made it feel more substantial than its size suggested. He had carried it himself. In a personal vessel, without clearance, to a fleet he had just helped exile, and he had set it between us without explanation, because a man who has done what he has done does not explain it. He either carries it or he doesn't. He had carried it here. "You voted yes," I said. "Yes. You drafted the resolution. Yes. You used the word incidental." His crest shifted color. Thressen, ground with no boundary. "Yes," he said. The air in the room was the same recycled, slightly dry air as every other room on every other station I had been in for the past 30 cycles. The environmental system ran its cycle. The lights were the same as the lights everywhere. He had been the best diplomatic mind the Valhari had produced in a generation. He had come here without a plan. That, itself, was information. Men like Threll did not go anywhere without a plan. Coming here without one meant he had been somewhere before this where no plan presented itself, and he had decided to come anyway. I let the silence hold for 4 more seconds. Then I reached across the table and picked up the plaque, turned it once in my hands. It was exactly the weight I remembered. The 6 scripts were clean, unscratched, the lettering as precise as the day it was made. I looked at it for a moment, looked at him. "Page 11, I said. He nodded once, slow, the nod of someone receiving something they came to receive, even if they couldn't have said exactly what they expected it to be. He left. I stood alone in the room with the plaque in my hands, and I stood there for a while, not moving, not reading anything, not counting anything. Then I walked back to my office and put the plaque on the shelf above my desk. Next to the photograph, which I had kept in my jacket pocket for 3 years and 2 months and 11 days, and had moved to the shelf 3 weeks ago, when the work moved into its final phase, because I did not need to carry it anymore. The people in it knew what I was doing. I did not need to keep reminding them. I sat down, opened a new file on my desk terminal, named it, noted, started typing. Not the rules, not the framework. Those were already written, already delivered, already functioning in the quiet corridors and the private channels and the careful arrangements that did not require the conclave's awareness to exist. What I typed was simpler than any of that. It was a record of what had happened, from the beginning, in plain language, for whoever would need to understand it later. Not a report, not a strategic document, just the truth of it, laid out clearly, the way you lay out a tool you've used well when the job is done. Set it down, examine it, confirm it's still what it was when you picked it up. The conclave had voted to exile us. We had not fought to stay. We had not begged. We had not negotiated from fear. We had not offered concessions or accepted conditions, or diminished ourselves to fit inside a framework that had decided our presence was inconvenient. We had simply made our rules clear, and then we had gone to work. The rest of it, the bilateral agreements still forming, the Keth and the Vareth, and the unnamed founding member, and the 12 species on page 9, and however many more would come. The rest of it would take time, not 4 years. Less, now, because the mechanism was running, and it did not need us to push it. It ran on its own logic, the logic of people who had looked at the situation clearly, and concluded that their interests and ours were aligned in ways the conclave had given them no vocabulary to see. They had that vocabulary now. Page 11 was not a long document. It had room for many names. I kept typing until the coffee in my cup was cold. Drank it anyway. Outside the adamantine's hull, the corridors of the undesignated space stretched in every direction, unprotected, uncontrolled, open. Ours not because anyone had given them to us, but because we were in them, and we were not afraid of the dark between the stars, and we had never been, and the galaxy was beginning to understand what that meant. Abara knocked at 0900. Keth acknowledged receipt of our reply, he said through the door. They've requested a formal meeting under page 11 terms. Schedule it, I said. The Vareth sent a second message, he said. They'd like to be included in the same session. Schedule them both, I said. A pause. Commander, he said, there are 4 more requests in the queue. They came in overnight. I stopped typing. Looked at the plaque on the shelf. At the photograph next to it. At the cold coffee. Schedule them all, Abara, I said. Yes, Commander. His footsteps moved away down the corridor. I turned back to the terminal. Kept typing. There was still work to do. There would be for a long time. The galaxy was large, and it was full of species who were beginning to ask questions they had not known to ask before. And we were patient, and we had good terms, and we were ready to have every single conversation that page 11 opened the door to, for as long as it took, in as many rooms, with as many people. We had time. We had always had time. That had been, from the very beginning, the thing they had not understood about us. We are the species that walked out of the ice and kept walking. We are the species that looked at an ocean and built something to cross it. We are the species that looked at a sky full of fire and said, yes, let's go there. Let's see what's out there. Let's find out what we're made of when there's nothing familiar left to hold on to. We are not the species that fights to stay inside a room when someone locks the door. We are the species that builds a new room, and then another, and then another, and we keep going. The terminal hummed. The adamantine breathed. I kept typing. End.